In this next hand, there's a middle position open for $20. I look down at ace queen offsuit on the button, make the call. The small blind puts in a 3-bet. Makes it $110 to go. The player who opened the pot, he goes ahead and makes the call. Could go either way here. Could be up against a squeeze play here out of the small blind. He does have a run-it-up shirt on, and I know this player. I do think he can mix it up a bit, but I don't think he's gonna get too berserk with too wide of a range. So I'm just gonna go ahead and flat here. I do have the button, so I can play in position post-flop. Flop comes down good for us again. It comes ace, jack, 6, rainbow. There's only a few hands that we lose to, such as pocket aces, we block that hand, ace king, we block that hand, and pocket jacks. Not a lot of combos of that. And then ace jack as well, but we block that too. The small blind continues for $135. The player in the middle folds, and we make a standard flat call here. Turn is pretty interesting. It's another jack, which brings a backdoor flush draw. Once again, my opponent bets to the tune of $225. It's a pretty interesting spot, and I don't think I can find a fold here. It's interesting because I wouldn't expect my opponent to bet a jack on the flop too often into two players on an ace-high board. I would often expect a hand such as king jack, queen jack, jack 10, anything with a jack in it aside from ace jack, which we block. I would expect all those hands to maybe check some percentage of the time. Maybe not all the time, but some percentage for sure. I would also expect an ace to slow down here, and I would expect a hand that picks up backdoor equity with a flush draw to go ahead and barrel. So I feel pretty comfortable calling here again. The river's a total brick, offsuit deuce, and once again, my opponent puts out a bet of $395. He's for sure going to be continuing with a lot of his hands that brick out on the river. We don't have any spades, so we don't block any flush draws, which for sure makes me want to call. We block a lot of value hands. There aren't a lot of combinations left that he could have for value on this river. So all of those things, including the fact that I would expect him to check a jack some percentage of the time on the flop, makes me want to go ahead and make the call. And that's what I do. I toss in the call, and my opponent rolls over jack 10 of clubs. So this one doesn't work out too well for us. It's one of those situations where just because I would do something on the flop doesn't mean all of my opponents would do something on the flop. I do know my opponent is a good player. I assume he's definitely a winning player in these games. And once again, he's got a run-it-up t-shirt on. So I can only assume that Jason Somerville gave him some ridiculous advice. Jason Somerville, he's a little bit past his prime. So, you know, old habits die hard. Watching those Jason Somerville streams, you pick up some things. It's tough to lose those things out of your game, and this opponent clearly has no idea what he's doing. Just kidding, I do know who this opponent is, and he's a very cool, friendly guy, good player. So, good hand, Chris, I guess. Next up is for sure one of the craziest hands, most interesting, most strange hands that I can remember playing on the vlog in a long time. Perhaps top 5 all time. The under the gun +2 player opens for $25. The player on his direct left calls, there's one call in hijack or cutoff. And once again, we're looking down at ace queen offsuit on the button. This time, I'm gonna go ahead and put in the squeeze. There's one or two too many players in this pot for my liking with ace queen offsuit. We have some blockers to some good hands, so I'm gonna go ahead and try and take this one down. I make it $130 there on the button. And the initial raiser folds, but the player to his left makes the call. Player on my right folds. As we're about to see the flop, my opponent says something interesting. He says, "I got nothing, bro." To which I say, "All right, bro." And then he says, "Just 4-5."
I got a 4-5. Put a 4-5 in.
All right, so he's announced that he has 4-5. Shortly after which, the flop comes down ace 2-3 with 2 clubs. It gets even more interesting. Hang on. It gets even more interesting here when my opponent goes ahead and bombs it. Bets $400 immediately. Not exactly loving the situation after he supposedly announced his hand. The board is kind of connected. We lose to some 2 pairs here. Ace is up, and potentially, if he was somehow being honest, we lose to a flopped wheel, as well as pocket 2s, pocket 3s. But having ace queen here, not gonna fold. Gonna have to see one more card at least. I go ahead and make the call. Turn is an interesting one. It's the king of clubs, which adds the nut flush draw to our holding, considering we have the queen of clubs. My opponent is not done bombing at this pot, however. This time he bets to the tune of $900. It's a little bit straightforward from my perspective. We're definitely gonna be beat a bunch of the time here, and I'm just gonna go ahead and go with it. Before I stick the money in there, I very honestly say, well, I have this card, and I show the queen of clubs.
Well, I got this card.
And say, I guess I'm just gonna have to go with it. and I move all in. Now it's not that much more money. It's literally maybe $100 extra. Somehow my opponent does not snap call. I think there's some potential I'm getting slow rolled here by a better hand than mine. I don't expect him to ever fold here for such a minute amount compared to the pot. And it gets really weird when my opponent continues to think and think and think. Not exactly sure what's going on here. Still expecting him to eventually put the money in. In the end, my opponent eventually folds. He folds. My opponent folds. Yeah, about $100 more. I suspect that my opponent had no pair, no draw, was using his story of the 4-5 to go ahead and try and take this pot down, and in fact had absolutely nothing whatsoever. Maybe like 10-9, 9-8, 8-7 with no club. Well, didn't matter if he had a club since I showed the queen of clubs. I'm pretty sure he was drawing dead, whatever it was. So maybe I shouldn't have shown the queen of clubs like that. It was just an honest sort of reaction from me in the moment where I was like, well, let's do this. Let's see what happens. Usually when I jam, I show my cards first, usually not before the other player calls. But that's what happened. I'm gonna take it. I'll be happy to take it down. Gets us unstuck after that ace-queen versus Jack-10 debacle, and things are looking up here. Playing four-handed with a straddle on. The button limps in. I look down at Jack-9 offsuit in the big blind incomplete, and the straddle checks. The flop came down Jack-9-3 with 2 spades, and I don't have a spade in my hand. I decided to lead right out for $40. Big blind folds, and the straddler puts in a small raise to $100. I don't want to let him draw for cheaply. A lot of times people will set their own price, but either way we have top 2 pair, and I'm looking to get more value. So I put in a 3-bet on the flop to $340, and my opponent makes the call. The turn is an offsuit king, which not the best card, but not the worst card. Worst card would be a spade. Again, I don't have any spades in my hand. I also don't block the straight, so again, not the greatest card. We also lose to king jack, but I decide to keep firing, keep charging those potential flush draws out there. I bet $410 here on the turn, and my opponent thinks for a little while before calling. The river is another less than ideal card. It's another king, offsuit king. So our 2 pair got counterfeited here. I go ahead and check it over to my opponent since I don't think I can get value from too much worse at this point. I can only hope to induce versus miss draws. So after I check, my opponent does go ahead and jam all in, but I don't feel that great about it, obviously. You know, the straight is still there, although I'm not super worried about a straight because there was a flush draw on the flop, and I would think that my opponent would raise the turn some frequency and try and get value from both flopped sets, 2 pairs, and potential flush draws. So we can discount that hand some percentage of the time, albeit not 100% of the time. We lose to hands such as king queen of spades, king 10 of spades, things like that. Hands that had a flush draw and have backdoored into rivered trips. What else do we lose to? I wouldn't think too much. We block full houses, so I'm not super worried about that situation. Just seems unlikely. I decided to rely on the fact that I don't have any spades in my hand and that he would have to, I figure, raise the turn some percentage of the time, like I said, with a straight. Rely on those factors, talk myself into a call, toss it in, and we get shown pocket aces. You know, there was some inkling in my mind that when he limped in pre-flop that he might have done so with a strong hand. It works out perfectly for him. He somehow manages to get the maximum in a limped pot with his pocket aces. It took a counterfeited 2 pair and a reasonable run out in order to get that maximum. But I'm pretty sure I could have found a fold. I think I'm not super happy with the call, but I do think there is merit to it. Again, since we don't block any flush draws and the board sort of bricks out, but our absolute value of our hand definitely goes down. There's also other aspects. I try not to talk about my opponents too much in these hand histories. This opponent had lost a couple of hands prior in very recent history, and I felt like he could have been steaming slightly, but turns out incorrect. Turns out he had a value hand there on the river, not a bluff. So we lose a big pot there. The good news, however, is that stuck it out, put in the grind, stayed longer than I was expecting to. We cash out from this game for $3,575. You guys know what that means. That means a profit of $75.